Have you ever witnessed a moment that left you speechless? A moment so shocking, so unbelievable, that you couldn't fathom it unfolding before your eyes? Imagine this: you're on a crowded flight, hundreds of people are seated in their assigned places, and everything seems calm and routine. The hum of the airplane, the sound of safety instructions being read, and the polite chatter of passengers. But then, suddenly, everything changes. A flight attendant, who is supposed to ensure the comfort and safety of everyone aboard, slaps a black passenger in the middle of the cabin. The tension in the air is palpable, the kind of moment that stops you in your tracks. Now, before you assume this was some isolated incident or an accident, what if I told you that just 2 minutes later, the flight attendant is fired on the spot? Yes, fired, no warning, no time to explain, just a swift decision made in the heat of the moment. What caused this dramatic turn of events? Why did a seemingly calm situation escalate so quickly? And who were the people involved? Was it just a simple misunderstanding, or was there something deeper at play? In this video, we're going to dive deep into the story of what happened when a flight attendant crossed a line, a moment of heated conflict, and the aftermath that unfolded in front of all the passengers. You'll hear the details, the raw emotions, and the shocking consequences that followed in those 2 minutes. But let's take a step back. What led to this confrontation? Who was this black passenger, and what were they doing when things took an unexpected and violent turn? And what exactly did the flight attendant think was the right thing to do in this situation? As we unfold the layers of this story, you'll see that it wasn't just a moment of a slap, it was the result of tension, assumptions, and a series of bad decisions that led to a public spectacle. And while you're wondering what could possibly follow after such a bold action, one thing is clear: the flight attendant's actions didn't just lead to a confrontation, but to an immediate decision from her boss that would change everything in the blink of an eye. Fired on the spot. But how did that conversation go? What happened in those 2 minutes after the slap? And how did the passengers react to what they had just witnessed? You won't believe what happened next. This story is far from over, and the real question is, what happens when a single moment can destroy a career, cause national outrage, and ignite a bigger conversation? Stick around as we break down every detail of this shocking incident that will leave you questioning how such an explosive event unfolded and what came of it. Get ready to find out what happened after the slap. The flight was supposed to be like any other. The passengers were just there to sit back, relax, and let the hours drift by as they traveled from one city to the next. But what they didn't know was that they were about to witness something that would shake them to their core. Something that would leave them questioning what they had just seen, wondering how it could have escalated so quickly. The flight attendant, a young woman with a bright smile and a professional demeanor, had been moving through the aisles, serving drinks and snacks, doing her job as usual. For all intents and purposes, it was just another flight. But then, something shifted. A disagreement sparked between her and a black passenger, a disagreement that quickly spiraled out of control. What was the issue? How did it go from a simple altercation to a moment where physical violence became the response? And, more importantly, how did the entire cabin react to it? Witnesses in the cabin recall a sudden change in the atmosphere, voices raised, tension building, and then, in an instant, the sound of a slap ringing through the air. A moment of shock, followed by disbelief. But the flight didn't stop there. The real twist came when, just minutes later, the flight attendant was called to the front of the plane. Her boss was waiting for her, and what happened in that brief exchange turned this flight from an ordinary journey into a headline-making event. Imagine the confusion, the uncertainty that must have flooded the flight attendant's mind. She had just acted in the heat of the moment, not expecting any kind of severe consequence. But the reality was brutal. Her boss had made a decision that would change her life forever. Fired. Just like that. No room for negotiation. No second chances. In less than 2 minutes, her career was over. But why was it so immediate? What exactly led to this harsh decision? Was it the slap? Or was there something more to it? As the plane continued its flight, the tension in the cabin was thick. Passengers whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. Some were shocked, others uncomfortable, but all were asking the same question: how did things escalate so quickly? And was it truly a case of the flight attendant being in the wrong, or was there something deeper, a misunderstanding that no one had fully understood yet? In this video, we're going to explore what happened during those crucial moments, break down the emotional roller coaster that unfolded in front of the passengers, and unravel the complex web of actions and reactions that led to a life-changing decision for the flight attendant. But that's not all, because the aftermath of this incident sparked a larger conversation. A conversation about racial tension, authority, and the power dynamics between passengers and airline staff. Was there more to this than meets the eye? Was the flight attendant's reaction truly unjustified, or was there a bigger issue at play that we need to look at? So, what happened after the slap? Was the passenger okay? What went down in the 2 minutes after the flight attendant was fired, and how did the rest of the passengers respond? This story doesn't just end with a slap, it unfolds into something much bigger. The real drama is what happens next. Hold tight as we dive deeper into the shocking incident and the aftermath that left everyone on the edge of their seats. Trust me, you won't want to miss the twist at the end of this unforgettable tale. As the flight continued its course, the hum of the airplane seemed to intensify, the kind of buzz that fills the cabin with a strange, unnerving energy. Passengers sat in their seats, looking out the windows, flipping through magazines, or trying to sleep. But there was an undeniable tension in the air. People exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to respond to what they had just witnessed. For many, this was not a typical flight experience. They had boarded expecting the usual routine: a drink, a snack, perhaps a bit of rest before landing. Instead, they had become involuntary witnesses to a scene that felt like it didn't belong in the confined space of a plane. The incident between the flight attendant and the black passenger had shifted the entire mood of the flight, and no one knew how to make sense of it. The slap had been a shocking moment, but it was the aftermath, the conversation that would follow, that was about to leave everyone with more questions than answers. Let's take a step back and look at the people involved in this incident. The flight attendant was a young woman, in her late 20s, with a pleasant demeanor and a reputation for being hardworking. She had been working as a flight attendant for several years and had always been known for her punctuality and professionalism. To her colleagues, she was someone who took her job seriously. She prided herself on being helpful, approachable, and always attentive to the needs of passengers. But that day, something seemed different. From the start, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The flight was not particularly crowded, but the few passengers on board seemed a bit more tense than usual. No one knew it yet, but there was an underlying friction between the flight attendant and the black passenger that would soon boil over. The man was in his early 40s, well-dressed, with a calm but assertive energy. He had boarded the plane quietly, settled into his seat without causing any trouble, and was doing what any typical passenger does, waiting for the flight to take off. But as the flight progressed, a small issue began to grow. The flight attendant had approached his row, offering a drink service. From there, things began to go off course. According to witnesses, the flight attendant had approached the passenger and asked what he wanted to drink. When the passenger made his choice, the flight attendant seemed to hesitate, her facial expression flickering with something: discomfort, perhaps, or irritation. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was, but the exchange was noticeably tense. What followed next was unclear, but some passengers recall hearing a raised voice. The passenger, who had been polite up until that point, had apparently become frustrated by what seemed to be an unprofessional response from the flight attendant. It was at this point that things took a turn. Some passengers said the flight attendant snapped at him, telling him that his order wasn't possible or that it would take longer than expected to prepare it. But why? What caused the sudden shift in tone? And what was behind the passengers' frustration? In the span of a few seconds, a disagreement escalated into something much more serious. The flight attendant, perhaps in an attempt to maintain control, became visibly upset. Her words became sharper, her body language more defensive. She made a comment that many of the other passengers would later describe as an unnecessary remark, one that pushed the passenger too far. He, in turn, responded, not with aggression, but with a calm, steady voice. He asked her to be more respectful, to acknowledge that he was a paying customer and deserved the same treatment as anyone else. At this moment, something seemed to snap. The flight attendant's frustration, her anger, and perhaps her own internal pressures, all came to the surface. In a split second, her hand swung forward, striking the passenger across the face. The slap echoed in the cabin, and time seemed to freeze for a moment. The other passengers stared in disbelief, unsure if what they had just witnessed was real or some strange dream. But it was real. And now the situation had reached a breaking point. The flight attendant's face went pale as soon as the slap landed. She immediately realized what she had done, but it was too late to take it back. The shock was written all over her face as she stood there, frozen, watching the passenger, who had been struck, slowly stand up and stare at her. The atmosphere shifted. People were no longer concerned about the small inconveniences of the flight. They were now watching an escalating confrontation unfold before them. In the seconds that followed, the flight attendant rushed toward the front of the plane, her steps quick, almost frantic. Passengers whispered to one another, exchanging their own theories and opinions about what had just happened. Was it a simple mistake? A loss of control? Or was there more to this than met the eye? Before long, the tension reached the cockpit. The flight attendant had reached her supervisor, a calm, no-nonsense man in his early 40s, who was sitting near the front of the plane. His expression didn't betray much emotion, but the moment he heard what had happened, his face grew serious. Without saying much, he motioned for the flight attendant to step aside. The conversation that followed was brief, but its impact was immediate. A couple of minutes later, the flight attendant was standing at the back of the plane, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had been told, no, ordered, to leave the cabin and head toward the rear exit. Her boss, without hesitation, had made the decision to fire her on the spot. The air around her was thick with discomfort. No one in the cabin knew exactly what had been said in the brief exchange between her and her boss, but the outcome was clear. The flight attendant was no longer part of the team. Passengers were left in stunned silence. Some of them had witnessed the slap, some had only heard about it, but all of them understood that something serious had just unfolded in front of them. Some passengers whispered about how unfair it seemed to fire her so quickly. Others were disgusted by the entire ordeal, feeling that her actions were unforgivable, no matter the circumstances. Everyone had their own opinion, but there was one thing they could all agree on: this wasn't just a case of a simple argument gone wrong. It was a moment that would stay with them long after the flight ended. The flight attendant's sudden removal from her duties left a bitter taste in the air, but the underlying questions lingered. What had really caused this altercation to escalate so quickly? Was it a simple misunderstanding, or were there deeper issues at play, issues that no one had anticipated? The passengers were left wondering, had the flight attendant been wronged, or was she truly to blame for what had happened? And what would happen to the passenger involved? What was his side of the story? Was he really the victim, or had he also played a role in pushing things over the edge? The mystery deepened as the flight continued, but the answers weren't coming. The tension, palpable from the moment the slap occurred, was still thick in the air, and everyone was left on edge, waiting for what would come next. As the flight continued, the lingering tension was undeniable. The hum of the airplane seemed louder than usual, almost oppressive in the way it filled the silence. Passengers had been trying to settle back into their routines, some burying their heads in books or watching movies to distract themselves, but it was impossible to ignore the incident that had just transpired. The flight attendant's sudden removal had left the cabin in a state of quiet disarray. Some passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others whispered in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the situation. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the scene was unfolding behind closed doors. The flight attendant stood awkwardly near the galley, away from the eyes of the passengers, her face pale and eyes cast downward. She was still processing what had just happened. She had been caught off guard by the slap. The decision to fire her had been swift, leaving little room for explanation or even reflection. All she could think about now was what went wrong and whether there had been any way to avoid the moment that had escalated so quickly. Her boss, the flight manager, had been calm, but firm. As soon as he'd been informed of the altercation, he had quickly made the call to remove her from her duties. His reasoning was simple: the flight had become a public spectacle, and it was something that couldn't go unnoticed. He had to protect the reputation of the airline, and the best way to do that was to act decisively. In the end, the incident wasn't just about the slap itself, it was about the impression it left on the passengers, many of whom had already pulled out their phones, documenting the entire situation. The flight attendant's supervisor wasn't just concerned about the immediate fallout. He also knew that an incident like this could easily become viral in the age of social media, with everyone capturing every moment on their phones. It wasn't just a matter of disciplining an employee, it was about managing the public relations nightmare that was quickly brewing. The moment the slap was witnessed, it could easily spread far beyond the cabin, reaching millions of people within minutes. For the flight attendant, however, the worst part wasn't the firing, it was the realization that she had just thrown away her career with one impulsive action. Her dream job, the one she had worked so hard for, had just been shattered in a matter of seconds. She tried to replay the events in her mind, wondering if she could have done anything differently. Maybe if she had kept her cool, or if the passenger had been more understanding, the situation wouldn't have spiraled out of control. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something more had been at play, something that no one had fully understood yet. The passenger, too, was trying to make sense of the situation. After the slap, he had returned to his seat, his expression unreadable, but his mind racing. The slap had stunned him, yes, but there was something deeper at play. He had been on the receiving end of what felt like an unjustified act of aggression, and now he was left wondering what he should do next. Was it worth saying something? Should he file a complaint? Or should he just let it go, knowing that the flight was almost over? But the slap had ignited something more than just anger. It had stirred up old feelings of injustice, of being treated unfairly because of his race. He had spent much of his life dealing with subtle, everyday racism, and though he had never encountered anything as extreme as this in such a public space, the sting of that slap felt like something deeper. It wasn't just about the flight attendant's actions, it was about the larger dynamic at play between them. She had crossed a line, not just with her physical action, but with her attitude, the way she had looked at him, the way she had spoken to him before the altercation. As the flight progressed, the unease between them lingered. There was a quiet understanding in the air that something had gone wrong, but no one knew exactly how to address it. The flight attendant, though no longer working, remained on the plane, her presence still felt, even if she was no longer interacting with the passengers. She had retreated to the back of the cabin, sitting in one of the vacant seats, her eyes glued to the floor. Some passengers who had witnessed the slap exchanged brief words with her, but no one dared to approach her too closely. Meanwhile, the rest of the passengers couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Many of them, still shaken by the incident, whispered to each other, trying to piece together the truth. Some passengers defended the flight attendant, believing it was a moment of stress or frustration that led to her actions. Others, however, felt that what she had done was completely unjustifiable. The slap had been violent, and it had crossed a line. It was hard for anyone to ignore the racial dynamics at play in the situation, with some speculating that there was more to the conflict than just a simple disagreement. A few passengers, feeling uncomfortable with the silence, decided to speak out. A young woman sitting near the front of the plane stood up and approached the flight manager. She asked if the flight attendant would be allowed to return to her duties, explaining that she felt the situation had been blown out of proportion. The flight manager, however, was unyielding. He calmly explained that the decision to fire the flight attendant had been made based on the severity of her actions. He acknowledged the complexity of the situation but made it clear that the airline had a strict policy when it came to maintaining a professional environment. As the flight neared its destination, the sense of unease continued to hang in the air. Everyone was eager for the ordeal to be over, but the unresolved tension lingered. The passengers knew that once they landed, the story of the slap would undoubtedly make headlines. The incident would likely be dissected, analyzed, and debated in the public sphere for days to come. But what would the public think of the flight attendant? Would they empathize with her, or would they condemn her for her actions? The last few minutes of the flight felt like an eternity. Passengers anxiously awaited the landing, their eyes scanning the cabin, unsure of what to say or do next. The flight attendant, still sitting quietly in the back, was lost in her thoughts, her mind racing with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Would she be remembered for the incident, or for the career she had built? Would her reputation ever recover, or had this moment forever changed everything? When the plane finally touched down, the air felt even heavier. Passengers slowly gathered their belongings, still processing what they had witnessed. The flight attendant, now just another passenger, quietly stood and walked off the plane. No one spoke to her. No one knew what to say. All that was left was the uncomfortable silence of a moment that no one could forget. As the plane came to a halt on the tarmac, the cabin's lights flickered off, signaling the end of the journey. The passengers began to shuffle to their feet, gathering their bags, but the air remained thick with the weight of what had just occurred. There was an unspoken understanding that the incident would not be forgotten easily. It was not just about the slap, it was about the context, the power dynamics, and the emotions that had erupted so unexpectedly. At the front of the plane, the flight manager was already preparing to disembark, walking briskly down the aisle with a sense of purpose. The passengers, now standing in line, could hear murmurs as he spoke quietly with another flight attendant, his tone sharp and deliberate. His decision to fire the flight attendant had not come without its own internal turmoil. He had been in the industry long enough to know how quickly situations could spiral out of control, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this entire episode. There had to be more to the story, something that had yet to be uncovered. Back in the rear of the plane, the former flight attendant, her eyes red from tears, stepped off the aircraft quietly, her head lowered in defeat. She moved with a kind of weight, as if she had already resigned herself to the judgment of others, to the life she now faced after what had happened. She had been a part of the airline industry for almost 5 years, had worked tirelessly to climb the ranks, and had always been praised for her dedication. But in those fleeting moments, it all came crashing down. Her thoughts were a blur as she walked through the terminal, her heart racing with each step. She had always tried to be the best version of herself on the job, patient, calm, helpful, but what had happened on that flight had shattered everything. The incident wasn't just a professional failure, it was personal. She could still feel the sting of the slap, the intense emotions that had fueled her decision. And as much as she tried to convince herself that she hadn't deserved to lose her job so quickly, she knew deep down that the consequences were inevitable. But what troubled her the most wasn't the slap itself, it was the way it had been handled. The speed with which she had been dismissed made it clear that there was no room for understanding, for a deeper examination of the situation. It was as if her entire career had been defined by that one moment, her humanity reduced to a single action. As she walked through the terminal, she couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if she had been given a chance to explain herself. If the circumstances had been different, if the tension in the air had been less palpable, if the passenger had been more forgiving, maybe things would have turned out differently. The black passenger, too, was left grappling with the aftermath of the incident. His emotions were a mix of anger and confusion. On one hand, he felt the weight of what had happened to him, a physical violation that seemed so out of place, so unjustified. He couldn't shake the feeling that the flight attendant had acted out of frustration, perhaps even bias, but at the same time, there was an uncomfortable part of him that wondered if he had done something to provoke her. Had his own frustration contributed to the escalation? Had he pushed her too far? The more he thought about it, the more complex the situation seemed. He knew he was in the right, he had been polite, calm, and had simply asked for respect. But the slap had felt personal, as if the flight attendant had targeted him specifically. It wasn't just the physical pain, but the way the whole episode had played out. He had spent so much of his life navigating situations like this, moments where the line between frustration and injustice blurred. He had seen it before, in subtle ways, but this time it had been blatant. As he walked through the airport, preparing to leave the terminal, he couldn't help but feel a surge of bitterness. He had been wronged, but the flight attendant had been fired without even a second thought. It was a strange kind of victory. He had, in a way, gotten justice, but he didn't feel like a winner. He was left with the same uneasy feeling that always lingered after an encounter like this, where the systems in place failed to address the deeper issues. The conversation, the context, the why, it all remained unresolved. Across the airport, the flight manager and the other staff were in the midst of their own debriefing. The airline had a reputation to maintain, and the events of the flight would soon make their way into the public eye. The flight manager had already briefed his superiors, and by the time the plane had landed, he knew the story would be spreading like wildfire. The slap was a spectacle, yes, but the questions it raised about race, power, and professionalism were far more complex. The flight manager's phone buzzed in his pocket, calls were coming in, both from within the airline and the media. There would be interviews, press releases, and likely, a public apology, but what did the apology really mean? Who was to blame here? The flight attendant? The passenger? Or was it something larger, something systemic, that had caused this to spiral out of control? Back at the airport, the passengers who had been on that flight slowly made their way out of the terminal. Some had forgotten about the incident almost immediately, eager to return to their everyday lives. But for others, the memory of what had happened would stay with them for much longer. Some still had unanswered questions. They had seen the flight attendant's swift removal, but they hadn't been told why. They had witnessed the slap, but they hadn't heard the full story. The conflicting emotions within them left them unsure of where they stood. There was one woman in particular who couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with how everything had unfolded. She had been sitting near the front of the plane, close enough to see the tension rise between the flight attendant and the passenger. She had noticed the brief exchange of words, the way the flight attendant's posture had shifted when the passenger made his request. And though she hadn't heard exactly what was said, she had felt the palpable shift in the air, the almost electric feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. Now, as she stood in the crowded airport terminal, she couldn't help but wonder if things could have gone differently. Was it truly just a matter of a frustrated flight attendant and an irritated passenger? Or was there something deeper, something more personal at play? Was the passenger wronged, or had the flight attendant been under more pressure than anyone could see? She couldn't stop thinking about it as she made her way to the exit. There were so many pieces of this puzzle that still didn't fit together. and as the night began to fall, she realized that the real story hadn't been told yet. The tension, the unresolved emotions, the questions, everything was still hanging in the air, waiting for someone to finally make sense of it all. But no one had the answers yet, and as much as everyone wanted to move on, they all knew deep down that this incident was far from over. The truth was still waiting to be uncovered. As the evening shadows grew longer, the airport buzzed with the usual post-flight chaos. Passengers moved in and out of terminals, each focused on their own immediate priorities, connecting flights, luggage claims, or meeting loved ones. Yet, for those who had been on that flight, the events of the day clung to them like a shadow. The slap, the firing, the unspoken tension, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved. In the back of the terminal, the former flight attendant sat in a small cafe, trying to gather her thoughts. She had left the airport as quickly as possible after disembarking, not wanting to linger in the place that now felt foreign to her. She had never imagined a day like this, never thought she'd be sitting here, with her career reduced to a single, painful incident. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop since she left the plane, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to check the messages. Friends, family, and colleagues had been reaching out, likely offering their sympathy, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. What was there to say? She had been fired in front of everyone, humiliated in a moment that felt like a lifetime. The passenger's face, calm and steady even after the slap, played over and over in her mind. She hadn't meant to strike him, she had just lost control for a split second. Her emotions had been building throughout the flight, but she hadn't thought it would lead to this. Now, all she had were questions. What had gone wrong? What had pushed her to act like that? And, perhaps more haunting, would she ever be able to make things right? Her phone rang again, but this time it was her manager's name on the screen. Her stomach turned. She didn't want to talk to anyone from the airline, didn't want to hear any more apologies or justifications. But she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. She took a deep breath and answered the call. Hello? Hey, it's Jake, her manager's voice came through, calm but with an edge of concern. I know you're probably not in the mood to talk, but we need to go over a few things. She bit her lip, her throat tight. I don't think there's much to go over. I messed up. You made your decision. That's it. There was a long pause before Jake spoke again, more gently this time. Listen, I know it's hard. I really do. But we need to get your side of the story. I've already had a talk with HR, but it's not too late for us to what? She interrupted, a little sharper than she intended. Do you think there's anything you can say that's going to change anything? They saw what happened. They're not going to change their mind. Jake sighed, his voice lowering. I get it. You're angry, and you have every right to be. But I'm just asking for a little more patience. We've handled these things before. It's not just about the slap, it's about the bigger picture. There are a lot of things that could have led to this, things that we need to understand. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. You're telling me that after all this, you're still going to try to explain my side? You really think that'll help? It's not about explanation, it's about context. We've got to look at everything, the stress, the pressures. I know it was a hard situation. If we can figure out how it escalated, we might be able to help you with the fallout. But right now, I need you to stay calm. We can still handle this. You're not the first person to lose it on a flight, and we'll figure out what went wrong together. But I need you to trust me. For the first time since the incident, she felt a small glimmer of something other than despair. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe there was a way to rebuild. Okay, she said slowly, unsure. I'll think about it. After hanging up, she sat in the cafe for a few more minutes, trying to process everything. Her emotions were raw, but the offer to discuss things further with Jake gave her a small thread of hope. She didn't know what would happen next, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to set the record straight. Meanwhile, the black passenger from the flight was also deep in thought. He had made his way home after leaving the airport, his mind unable to settle. As much as he tried to move on, he couldn't stop replaying the moment when the flight attendant had slapped him. It had been a physical violation, yes, but it was also more than that. It had been a statement, an unwarranted display of power. And as much as he tried to avoid it, the racial undertones that seemed to hang in the air couldn't be ignored. He had spent a lifetime navigating these situations, quietly enduring the subtle biases that came with being a black man in a world that often saw him differently. The slap had felt like the culmination of all those smaller slights, all those moments when he had been dismissed, judged, or treated unfairly. But what disturbed him more was the speed with which the airline had acted. It had all been over so quickly. One wrong move, and she was gone. It was as if her career had been erased. In the quiet of his apartment, he thought about what had happened, his anger simmering just below the surface. Was he justified in feeling wronged? Was the flight attendant's behavior truly rooted in racial bias, or had he simply been caught in an unfortunate situation? His mind raced, questioning everything. But one thing was clear, the slap had set off a chain of events that neither he nor the flight attendant could escape. And no matter what happened next, the fallout from that moment would affect both of their lives in ways they hadn't even begun to understand. At the same time, in the airport's quieter corners, the ripple effect of the incident continued. A few passengers who had witnessed the altercation were already talking about it on their social media accounts. As word spread, so did the conflicting opinions. Some praised the flight attendant's firing, calling it a necessary act of discipline, while others questioned whether the airline had been too hasty in its decision. A handful of voices, those who had been closest to the action, were eager to share their own versions of what had transpired, but the story kept changing as it passed from one person to the next. One thing was certain, the debate around the incident was far from over. It wasn't just about a slap. It was about race, power, and how we interact with one another in tense moments. The passengers, the flight attendant, and the man who had been slapped were now part of a larger narrative, one that was beginning to take shape in the public eye. But no one knew how it would play out. Would the airline's swift actions be enough to quell the storm, or was there something deeper that needed to be addressed? The questions kept building, but the answers remained elusive. As the night wore on, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, a story that would unfold in unexpected ways, with each twist and turn leading to more questions, more tensions, and more revelations. The slap, it seemed, was only the first act of something far more complicated, and the real truth, the full story, had yet to be told. The following days dragged on like a never-ending storm, each one more tense than the last. The incident was all anyone could talk about. The media had caught wind of the story, and what had once been a routine flight had now become a headline. Newspaper articles, blog posts, and social media threads were filled with debates. Was it an isolated mistake? A moment of weakness? Or was there something darker at play, a simmering undercurrent of racial tension, injustice, and unaddressed workplace pressure? The former flight attendant had kept to herself, staying out of the public eye as much as possible. Her phone had stopped ringing, her inbox filling only with formal emails from HR and legal teams. But when she opened her social media, she saw it all, the memes, the opinions, the personal attacks. Some were sympathetic, others enraged. One by one, the comments flooded in, condemning her actions while others demanded answers. What no one seemed to understand was that there were pieces to this story no one had heard. No one knew what had really happened behind the scenes, the stresses, the context of her mind on that flight. She spent long hours pacing in her apartment, her thoughts swirling. What if she could somehow make her case known? What if there was more to the story than the world had seen? As much as she wanted to explain herself, to share the stress she'd been under, she knew doing so publicly would be a gamble. She could only imagine how her words might be twisted or misinterpreted. But silence was starting to feel like a worse option. At the same time, the passenger found himself mired in the fallout too. The news outlets didn't focus as much on his side, but the message boards and comment sections were filled with his name. Many praised him for staying calm in the face of the incident, some even saying he had done the right thing by not retaliating physically. But there was something unsettling in the constant praise. It didn't feel like the justice he had hoped for, nor the resolution he sought. He wasn't looking for sympathy, he just wanted the truth to come out. What had caused the flight attendant to snap in such a public way? Why had it escalated as it had? The days passed, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken. Every day, more passengers who had been on that flight came forward with their versions of the events. Some said the flight attendant had been on edge throughout the flight, others claimed the passenger had been rude or demanding. As these stories circulated, they only deepened the confusion, leaving people wondering if anyone truly understood what had happened. The pieces of the puzzle didn't seem to fit together. Then, one afternoon, the passenger received an unexpected call. It was from the airline. "We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the incident," the voice on the other end said. "We believe there are aspects of this situation that need to be resolved, and we'd like to hear your side more thoroughly." The call caught him off guard. Until now, the airline had only seemed concerned with managing the optics, not truly hearing what had happened from his perspective. He agreed to the meeting, his heart pounding in his chest. This could be the moment when things finally made sense, when all the confusion and unresolved tension could be addressed. Or, it could be just another attempt to put a band-aid on a wound that ran deeper than anyone realized. Meanwhile, the flight attendant was also gearing up for her own confrontation. The company had asked her to meet with the HR department for a final debrief. She wasn't sure what they expected from her, but she knew it wasn't going to be an easy conversation. She could already feel the weight of her actions bearing down on her, the fear that everything might come to an abrupt end. She hadn't slept much in the past few days, her mind running through every possible outcome. Would they offer her a second chance? Or would they confirm what she feared most, that her career in aviation was truly over? The thought of never being able to work in this industry again, of losing everything she had built over the years, seemed unbearable. Yet there was also a part of her that couldn't help but wonder if this was the universe's way of forcing her to face the truth, the pressure, the tension, the limits she had unknowingly reached. Was this incident just the tipping point, the final straw in a long chain of struggles she hadn't fully acknowledged? As the day of their respective meetings arrived, both the flight attendant and the passenger prepared for what they knew would be uncomfortable, confrontational moments. The air was thick with anticipation. For the flight attendant, it was about finding the courage to face the consequences of her actions, hoping somehow to regain a sense of control over her future. For the passenger, it was about gaining some sense of closure, but more importantly, ensuring that the truth was heard, no matter the cost. Neither of them had any idea what the outcome would be. But both were driven by the same underlying desire, to be understood, to have their sides of the story recognized. At the HR office, the flight attendant sat across from two senior managers, their expressions unreadable. The room was quiet, the tension hanging in the air like an electric charge, as the conversation began. The managers asked her about the events leading up to the incident, about her actions and her mindset. She spoke carefully, recounting everything she remembered from the flight, from the mounting stress to the brief but intense confrontation with the passenger. She explained that she had never meant for things to escalate the way they had. She was vulnerable, honest, she knew she had lost control, but she hoped her vulnerability might count for something. Meanwhile, in another room, the passenger sat, his heart racing as the airline's representatives spoke to him. They apologized for the situation, reassured him that his concerns were valid, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still trying to contain the damage, not truly understand what had occurred. Their questions were carefully crafted, as if they were searching for the right angle to protect their own reputation, rather than looking to get to the heart of the matter. The longer the meeting went on, the more it became clear that both sides were struggling with the same unspoken truth, that the situation wasn't as simple as anyone wanted it to be. The flight attendant's actions had been wrong, but her motivations had been complex. The passenger had been wronged, but the context was murkier than anyone had anticipated. The deeper questions were about power, pressure, and how a single moment of frustration could explode into something far bigger. As both meetings wrapped up, there was a sense that something was about to shift. But what? Would they reconcile? Would the truth finally come to light in a way that satisfied both sides? Or would the conflict deepen, leaving both of them more entrenched in their positions than ever before? The answers seemed just out of reach, hanging like an unfinished sentence. And with every passing second, the tension built, reaching a boiling point where something had to give. The following days felt like a waiting game. Both the former flight attendant and the passenger found themselves stuck in limbo, caught between the past that had already happened and an uncertain future that seemed to hold more questions than answers. The moment of reckoning they had both prepared for, those tense meetings with the airline, had left them with more uncertainty than clarity. But there was something they both couldn't shake. Despite the mounting pressure, neither one felt any closer to understanding what had gone wrong or what the resolution would be. For the flight attendant, the aftermath of the meeting with HR had been a blur. She had been honest, but she couldn't escape the feeling that her words hadn't been enough. The airline representatives had nodded sympathetically, but they seemed to be hearing only part of her story. She knew they weren't interested in the full truth, the complexity of the pressure she had been under, or the broader context of what had led to the explosive outburst. All they cared about was the slap. The moment that everyone else would remember. But what about everything that had led up to it? The pressure from the management to perform perfectly on every flight, the long hours, the stress of dealing with difficult passengers, the emotional toll of a job that demanded her to be cheerful and accommodating even when she felt broken inside? No one cared about that. No one seemed to see that she had been stretched thin, and the moment she snapped had been a product of that exhaustion. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the airline had already made up its mind. The firing felt final, like an irreversible decision. And still, the public opinion on social media raged on. Everyone had their own version of the story, throwing blame and speculation in every direction. The flight attendant was called everything from unprofessional to unstable. Some even went as far as to call her actions a blatant display of racism, painting her as an embodiment of every unjust act they'd witnessed. There were voices of support, but they were drowned out by the louder critics. Her life was no longer just hers, it had been consumed by this public spectacle. In the meantime, the passenger also wrestled with his thoughts. The meeting with the airline hadn't brought him the clarity he had hoped for. They had apologized for the incident, of course, but it felt hollow, as if they were trying to clean up a mess they had no intention of addressing. He had been asked to share his side of the story, but the questions they posed were vague, more focused on the company's position than on understanding his perspective. They made it clear they were focused on damage control, on making sure this didn't spiral into something bigger. The passenger had hoped for a moment of reconciliation. Perhaps, if they could sit down together, both he and the flight attendant could get past the incident and come to an understanding. But after that meeting, he had started to feel that such an exchange was unlikely. Both sides were too entrenched in their own narratives, their own pain, to come to any meaningful resolution. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was never just about the slap. This was about everything that had built up to that moment, the frustrations, the exhaustion, the tensions that simmered beneath the surface, unseen and unaddressed. What did it mean to be heard in a system that seemed to silence people at every turn? Was he any less a victim of a broken system just because he hadn't raised his voice in retaliation? Or was he part of a larger pattern that no one was willing to confront? These questions gnawed at him, kept him awake at night. He found himself reading more into the behavior of the flight attendant, questioning her actions more deeply than he ever had before. Was it a random outburst, or was there a deeper reason she reacted the way she did? The story had taken on a life of its own. It had moved far beyond the flight, beyond the incident, and had evolved into a larger conversation about power, race, and what happens when people push each other too far. It seemed like everyone was waiting for the real story to emerge. Was it simply about a single unfortunate moment? Or was there something more insidious behind the flight attendant's actions? The longer this dragged on, the more people speculated, and the more the story spread across every media platform. The flight attendant, in particular, felt trapped by the very public nature of it all. She had always prided herself on maintaining her professionalism, on keeping a level head in stressful situations. Yet now, her every move was being scrutinized by an audience that only saw her as a caricature, as the villain of a story they had pieced together without ever hearing her side. She had no way to take back the moment she had lost control. But she did know one thing: she wasn't a monster. She wasn't the person people were making her out to be. She didn't want to be defined by a single moment of weakness. She had tried to reach out, to set the record straight, but every time she posted something, it felt like it backfired. The comments on her social media were a battleground, every post met with fierce opinions and judgment. No matter what she said, no matter how she framed the story, it was already too late. The public had made its decision. She was the flight attendant who slapped a passenger. And that would be how she would be remembered. One morning, an email arrived in her inbox. It was from her lawyer. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. The subject line read, "Legal Proceedings." A chill ran through her veins as she clicked on the message, already knowing what it would say. The airline had not only terminated her employment but was also pursuing legal action over the incident. They had already filed a lawsuit, claiming that her behavior had caused irreparable harm to the company's reputation. The stakes were higher now. She was being dragged into a legal nightmare that could affect her life for years to come. She stared at the email, the weight of the words sinking in. Meanwhile, the passenger had found his own troubles multiplying. The media was beginning to turn its attention to him as well, now questioning whether he was simply trying to get compensation from the airline. Some outlets had even suggested he might be taking advantage of the situation for personal gain. He never asked for compensation. He never wanted anything but acknowledgement of the truth. But as the narrative shifted, he found himself drawn deeper into a web of speculation and judgment. The questions were no longer about the incident. They were about him, his intentions, his character. It seemed the whole world was looking for someone to blame. But the more they dug, the more the story became complicated, fractured by perception, tangled in emotion, and blurred by competing interests. It was clear that no resolution would come easily. But the question lingered in the air: who would take the fall? And would anyone walk away from this, not only with their dignity intact, but with an understanding of what had really happened? The tension was building. No one had the answers yet. But it was clear that something big was coming, something that could change the way people thought about the situation entirely. The clock was ticking, and the conflict was far from over. As the pressure continued to mount, both the former flight attendant and the passenger felt like they were caught in a storm, each trying to navigate through an overwhelming wave of scrutiny and uncertainty. The tension was reaching a boiling point, but neither of them knew just how much deeper the rabbit hole would go. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict, and it seemed like there was no turning back. But what neither of them anticipated was the game-changing twist that would come next, one that would alter everything they thought they knew about the incident. It started with a quiet message. The flight attendant, buried under the weight of the legal proceedings and mounting media attention, received an unexpected phone call one afternoon. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. It was someone from the airline's legal department. "We've discovered something," the voice said, a slight edge of urgency in their tone. "Something we should have caught earlier." She sat up straight, a sinking feeling gnawing at her stomach. What now? Had they found something incriminating about her? Was this just another step toward making sure she would never work in aviation again? The voice continued, "We've reviewed the security footage from that flight again. Something doesn't add up." The flight attendant's mind raced. What could they possibly have missed? She had seen the footage herself, she knew what had happened. The confrontation, the slap, it was all there. But then the legal representative dropped the bombshell. "There was another incident earlier on that flight, before you had the altercation with the passenger. We believe something in the cabin may have contributed to your actions." Her heart skipped. What was he talking about? What had happened earlier that could possibly justify her behavior? The legal team explained that the earlier footage had revealed a strange interaction. A different passenger, someone sitting near the back of the plane, had been involved in a tense exchange with another flight attendant. This passenger, whose behavior had gone unnoticed until now, had been causing a scene for several minutes before the main altercation. At first, it seemed insignificant. Just a passenger causing some minor inconvenience. But as they analyzed the footage, something became clear. The person in question was making subtle but aggressive comments to the flight crew, creating a charged atmosphere. The flight attendant, already stressed, had witnessed the scene unfold before her very eyes. The realization hit like a lightning bolt. This was the missing piece. She had been overwhelmed, caught in the middle of an escalating situation she had not been prepared for. She had seen this other passenger's behavior and internalized it, without even realizing it. The negative energy had contributed to her loss of composure. The emotional weight of dealing with an unruly passenger earlier had built up in her, leaving her vulnerable when the confrontation with the passenger she slapped finally took place. For the first time since the incident, the flight attendant felt like she had an explanation that could justify her reaction. She wasn't trying to excuse it, but this new piece of information gave her a sense of understanding. She wasn't the only one who had been affected by the negative energy on that flight. The entire crew had been walking on eggshells, and that hidden tension had infected every part of the cabin. But before she could process everything, another unexpected development hit. Her lawyer called her a few hours later, voice heavy with urgency. "There's been a leak," they said. "The footage, it's gone public." The flight attendant's blood ran cold. She hadn't anticipated this. The details she had just learned were supposed to stay within the legal team. Now, with the footage in the hands of the media, everything was about to change again. The leak was already making waves. Her heart sank as she saw the headlines flash on her screen, the story spreading like wildfire. Flight attendant's outburst linked to earlier passenger conflict, the title screamed. But it wasn't just the footage of her altercation that had been leaked, it was the interaction between the earlier unruly passenger and the crew that had now become part of the narrative. As she read through the comments on the story, it became clear that this new development was creating a massive shift in the public's perception. Some people believed her story now, feeling sympathy for the pressure she had been under. Others, however, saw the leak as evidence that the airline had mishandled the entire situation, choosing to sweep the issue under the rug until they were forced to deal with it. Now, the story wasn't just about her, but about the airline's culture of mismanagement and poor treatment of its employees. The focus was shifting, and no one could predict where it would lead. Meanwhile, the passenger was struggling to digest this new revelation. He had never asked for any of this attention. His goal was always to bring light to the incident and be heard. But now, with this footage coming to the surface, the narrative was changing in ways he hadn't expected. The public was torn. Some felt like this new context excused the flight attendant's behavior, while others argued it was no excuse at all. He found himself in the middle of a media frenzy, unsure of where he stood in all of this. The moment of clarity he had been hoping for was slipping through his fingers. His emotions were all over the place. He was still hurt by the incident, but now there was a shift in the conversation. People were looking at him as a catalyst for the flight attendant's behavior, and some of the comments were veering dangerously close to blaming him for her outburst. He had no control over the media's narrative. What was once a personal matter was now a circus of opinions, and the line between victim and villain had blurred beyond recognition. In the days that followed, both of them found themselves trapped by the growing intensity of the situation. The airline, now in full damage control mode, began to distance itself from the controversy. The media, in their rush to capitalize on the drama, started focusing less on the incident itself and more on the fallout. Legal teams from both sides scrambled to prevent further leaks, but it was clear that no one could contain the chaos now. With each passing hour, the stakes continued to rise. What had begun as a simple confrontation between a flight attendant and a passenger had spiraled into a much larger and more complex issue. Allegations of mistreatment, emotional tolls, and corporate responsibility were now on the table. Neither the flight attendant nor the passenger could escape the consequences of this growing storm. And no one could predict how the final chapter of this story would unfold, but one thing was certain: the conflict was far from over. The tension was suffocating. The flight attendant and the passenger were no longer just individuals caught in a disagreement, they were pawns in a much larger game, each move setting off a ripple effect that spread across the media, the airline, and their personal lives. The incident, once thought of as a fleeting moment of chaos, had transformed into an ongoing saga. And with each new twist, the stakes climbed higher. As the media storm intensified, the airline found itself on the defensive. For the first time in years, their carefully cultivated reputation was under fire. They had always prided themselves on providing top-tier service, but now, with this scandal bubbling at the surface, the company had no choice but to publicly address the situation. Press conferences, corporate statements, and interviews filled the airwaves. But despite their efforts to control the narrative, it was clear the damage was done. Behind closed doors, the flight attendant's lawyer was scrambling. The leaked footage was more damaging than anyone had anticipated, and now her defense was grounded in a web of conflicting information. The airline's legal team was relentless, pushing forward with their lawsuit against her. But the public's reaction was unpredictable. Some saw the new footage and empathized with her, understanding that she had been under extreme stress. Others dug in their heels, insistent that her actions were indefensible. The flight attendant found herself on an emotional roller coaster. 1 minute, people were offering support, and the next, she was being branded a disgrace. Despite the media frenzy, the flight attendant began to feel a strange sense of clarity emerging from the chaos. She had been forced to confront a side of the industry she had never fully understood before, one that saw employees as dispensable and the pressures of the job as invisible until they exploded. She wasn't just a disgraced worker now, she was a symbol of a much larger issue. Employees like her were pushed to their limits every day, and yet no one ever seemed to acknowledge the toll it took. The public had made her the face of that frustration, whether she wanted it or not. But there was something deeper at play. A strange unease had settled in her gut. The way the footage had been leaked, so perfectly timed to cause maximum disruption, felt deliberate. It was as if someone had pushed the button, knowing it would force the airline to act. But who had the power to manipulate the situation like that? And why hadn't the footage been discovered sooner, if it was so important? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a puppet master in the background, orchestrating events. Meanwhile, the passenger, too, was beginning to feel the pressure of the spotlight. His every word and action were being scrutinized by the media, and it felt like there was no escaping the controversy. As he scrolled through the comments, he saw the shift. His role in the story was changing, and not in the way he had hoped. The initial wave of sympathy he had received was now being overshadowed by a growing narrative. Was he just as complicit in the conflict as the flight attendant? The whispers began. Some people now questioned his behavior on that flight. Was he simply an innocent victim, or had he pushed the flight attendant too far? As more footage was released, snippets from the entire flight, his interactions with the crew started to surface, raising doubts. Was he as calm and collected as he had originally portrayed himself? Or was there more to the story that no one had considered? His reputation, once secure, was now being chipped away by the very people who had once been on his side. The pressure was too much. The airline, sensing an opportunity to gain some control over the situation, quietly offered the passenger a settlement, an undisclosed sum of money in exchange for him staying out of the media. At first, he was taken aback. He had never wanted money. All he had wanted was to be heard, to have his side of the story taken seriously. But now, with the whole world watching, he felt like a commodity being bought and sold. Was this the resolution he had been hoping for? Or was it just another way for the powerful to silence those who didn't fit their narrative? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the entire incident, the ensuing media circus, and even the settlement offer felt staged. There was no way the airline would suddenly offer him money out of the blue unless they were trying to cover something up. What was really at play here? He wasn't sure anymore. He was beginning to feel like a character in a much larger story, one he didn't fully understand. The flight attendant, too, was starting to piece things together. She had kept her head down, focusing on the legal battle and trying to stay afloat. But now, seeing how the passenger was being pulled deeper into the drama, she began to wonder if he too had been manipulated. Had the whole incident been orchestrated, from the tension with the unruly passenger to the flight that would set everything in motion? She couldn't ignore the eerie feeling that someone was behind it all, pulling strings and watching as the chaos unfolded. As both of them became more entwined in the escalating story, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The flight attendant received an anonymous message one night. It was short and cryptic, just a few lines, but enough to make her heart race. "You weren't the only one being watched," it read. "You've been set up. Find out who leaked the footage. The truth is bigger than you think." For the first time, she felt like someone else knew what was really happening. Someone else understood the deeper game being played. She couldn't ignore it. She knew she had to find out who was behind all of this. She had to figure out why the footage had been leaked, who had orchestrated the events that led up to that fateful moment on the plane, and what the true story was. The mystery deepened. The conflict between the flight attendant and the passenger was no longer just about a slap or a momentary loss of control. It was now a tangled web of manipulation, secrecy, and hidden agendas. Both of them were being pushed to their limits, forced to confront the darkest corners of the airline industry and their own lives. But with every new twist, the question remained, who was truly behind this, and what did they stand to gain? And as both sides began to piece together the fractured story, it became clear that the stakes were far higher than either of them had imagined. The final confrontation, the truth of what had really happened, was drawing nearer. But they were still miles away from uncovering the full picture. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, the flight attendant's mind raced. She had spent days following the cryptic clues, desperately trying to make sense of the forces at play. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that everything she thought she knew about the incident had been manipulated. And now, standing on the edge of a revelation, she was ready to confront the truth. It was time to meet the source of the mysterious message, the person who had sent the note, who had hinted that the whole situation was part of a larger scheme. The flight attendant was nervous, but determined. She had no other choice but to pursue the lead. After a series of covert exchanges, she found herself standing in a dimly lit room in a downtown building, facing someone she didn't recognize. The person sat behind a desk, their face obscured by shadows. "You wanted the truth," they said in a low, even voice. "You've been looking for it in all the wrong places." The flight attendant's heart raced. "Who are you? Why did you set this whole thing in motion? What did you want from me?" A quiet laugh filled the room. "You think you were the only one targeted? You're not the victim here. You're just a piece of the bigger picture." With each word, the flight attendant felt the ground beneath her feet start to shift. Her mind reeled. She wasn't ready for this. This wasn't what she had expected. The story she had pieced together in her head, the one where she was an innocent bystander, was crumbling before her eyes. The person across the desk leaned forward, revealing a familiar face. Her jaw dropped as she recognized them. It was one of her former colleagues, someone who had always seemed friendly, unassuming, even loyal. But now, the truth was clear: they had been behind the leak, the manipulation, and everything that followed. It was all part of a larger game. "You don't understand," the colleague said, eyes cold and calculating. "The system is broken, and people like you and the passenger? You were just pawns in the plan. It was never about you two. It was about shaking the system to its core." The flight attendant felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. You did this? You caused everything?" The colleague nodded slowly, their smirk widening. "You have no idea what's at stake. This whole incident, it was meant to expose the deeper problems in the industry. People are tired of being treated like numbers, like nothing more than replaceable cogs in the machine. I needed someone, anyone, to snap. I needed the world to see the pressure that workers like you are under. It was never personal, it was a test. A message." The weight of those words hit her like a punch to the gut. Everything, the slap, the media circus, the public outcry, had been orchestrated. And she had played right into it. Her outrage, her confusion, had been exactly what this person had wanted. It was all part of a carefully planned setup to expose the airline's exploitation of its employees. But it wasn't over yet. As the flight attendant processed the revelation, the colleague slid a file across the desk. "You're not the only one who's been manipulated. The passenger? His involvement in all this? It was no accident either." The file contained photographs, emails, and records detailing the passenger's background. At first glance, it seemed like a random collection of documents, but the more the flight attendant read, the more it became clear: the passenger, too, had been targeted. His involvement in the incident was far more than a mere coincidence. Like her, he had been part of the grand scheme, a pawn in the game, manipulated into playing his part in the unfolding drama. The reality hit like a thunderbolt. The airline, the media, even the lawyers, everyone had been swept into this web of manipulation. The colleague had engineered everything, from the passenger's prior actions to the perfect timing of the footage leak. The flight attendant wasn't just a victim, she was an integral part of a calculated move to expose everything that was wrong with the system. But the ultimate twist? The passenger had been just as much a part of the plan as she had. Her heart raced as she processed the final revelation. "So, you've been using both of us this entire time? You set us up to destroy our lives, just to send a message?" Her colleague leaned back in their chair, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "The truth isn't pretty, but sometimes, it takes something extreme to open people's eyes. The way they treat flight attendants, The pressure they put on staff to keep quiet about the cracks in the system, it's all been building for years. You think the world cares about a flight attendant's breakdown? Or a passenger's complaint? No, they care about the spectacle. I needed them to see the truth. To wake up. It was as though everything had spiraled out of control, yet there was no way to turn back now. The flight attendant felt a sharp pang of betrayal. She had thought she was fighting for her dignity, for justice, but now, she realized she had been unknowingly fighting for a cause she had never signed up for. The stakes had been so much higher than she'd ever imagined. She didn't know what to say. Her thoughts raced, but the shock of it all left her speechless. All she could do was stare at the person who had pulled the strings, trying to reconcile the friendly colleague she once knew with the cold strategist before her. "And what happens now?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The colleague smiled, a dark glint in their eyes. "Now? You have a choice. You can walk away, leave all of this behind and move on with your life. Or you can join me, help me expose the corruption at the heart of the system. The choice is yours." Her mind was spinning. The confrontation had been intense, revealing layers of manipulation that she never could have anticipated. But despite the betrayal, despite the shock, there was one thing that lingered. A part of her knew that if she walked away now, it would all be for nothing. The pressure, the pain, the loss, it would all have been in vain. She had to make a decision. Before she could respond, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. The door to the room swung open, and her former colleague's face drained of color. In the doorway stood the passenger, looking every bit as disoriented and angry as she felt. It was clear that the final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place. Neither of them had expected to meet here, but now it was inevitable. The truth, the final twist, was about to be revealed, leaving both of them with no way out. As the flight attendant and the passenger locked eyes, the reality hit them both. They were no longer fighting a system. They were fighting each other, caught in a web of deceit that neither had the power to escape. And as the room closed in around them, they both realized that this wasn't just about their fates anymore. This was about something much bigger. The real question was, who would walk away unscathed? And who would pay the ultimate price for everything that had been set in motion? The moment felt frozen in time. The flight attendant and the passenger stood there, facing each other in a room full of tension and unanswered questions. Their eyes locked, each of them filled with the weight of the situation that neither had ever expected to find themselves in. The colleague, who had once been just a friendly face, was now the mastermind behind it all, and the pressure in the room was palpable. The passenger took a slow step forward, his expression filled with confusion and anger. "So this was all some kind of setup?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "You used us, manipulated us to make some kind of statement about the system?" His words hung in the air, and the flight attendant could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed everything that had just been revealed. She didn't know what to say. It wasn't just about the SLAP anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that had affected both of them in ways they hadn't realized until now. The colleague watched them closely, enjoying the discomfort, the unraveling of their worlds. "It was never about you two. You were both chosen because you represented the extremes of the system. The overworked employee pushed too far, and the paying passenger who demands service at any cost. This isn't just about what happened on that plane. It's about everything that's wrong with how people are treated in the industry, how the powerful use and discard those below them." The flight attendant's hands shook slightly as she took in the words. She had always known the pressures of the job, the constant stress, and the unreasonable expectations. But to hear someone else put it into words, to see how the whole thing had been orchestrated, it was overwhelming. And yet, there was something in her that began to shift. Despite everything, despite being used as a pawn in a game she never understood, she realized that the message her colleague was sending wasn't entirely wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a siren wailing outside the building, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. It wasn't long before 2 officers appeared at the door, followed by a team of investigators. The moment had arrived, and it was clear that everything was about to change. The colleagues' confident posture faltered. They glanced nervously at the approaching officers, realizing that their grand plan was about to unravel. "You think this will change anything?" the colleague muttered, their voice suddenly devoid of the power it had held earlier. "The system won't change. This will blow over, just like everything else. You'll be forgotten." The officers moved swiftly, handcuffing the colleague and reading them their rights. The flight attendant stood there, still processing what had happened, as the passenger stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The sudden quiet felt unnatural after everything that had unfolded, and it seemed like the weight of everything, every question, every emotion, had hit them at once. Once the colleague was taken away, the flight attendant turned to the passenger. His face was a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. "I never knew it would come to this," he said softly, his voice trailing off. "I never asked for any of this." She nodded. "Neither did I. But somehow, we both got caught in the middle of something bigger. And now, we're both left picking up the pieces." The next few days were a blur of interviews, legal proceedings, and public statements. The media, which had once blasted the incident across every platform, now turned its attention to the fallout. The story had taken on a life of its own, and the public's perception of the situation was beginning to shift. No longer were the flight attendant and the passenger merely characters in a scandal, they were symbols of a broken system, victims of forces far beyond their control. The airline, desperate to salvage its image, issued a formal apology to both the flight attendant and the passenger. They offered the flight attendant a settlement, along with an assurance that they would address the systemic issues she had inadvertently brought to light. It was a hollow gesture, but it did provide some measure of closure. The passenger, too, was offered compensation for his role in the controversy, though he remained deeply conflicted about accepting it. As the dust settled, the flight attendant found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She had been forced to confront the flaws of an industry she had once believed in. But in doing so, she had also learned something about herself. She was more than just a cog in the machine. She was a person, with her own strength and resilience. And although the system had tried to break her, she was still standing. She also realized that the passenger had been through his own ordeal, one that had left him scarred in ways she could never fully understand. He had been caught in a situation he didn't ask for, forced to play a part in someone else's game. But in the end, they had both emerged from the chaos stronger, with a newfound understanding of the world they had once inhabited. The final twist came when both the flight attendant and the passenger received a letter from the colleague, now facing charges. It was short, but it left an indelible mark. "You were always meant to be part of something bigger. You've seen the cracks, but you have the power to help fix them. Don't forget that." The letter was a reminder that the story didn't end with them. It was a call to action, a push to keep fighting for change, even when it seemed impossible. For the flight attendant, it meant looking beyond her own experience and understanding that the fight wasn't over. She could be part of something bigger than herself, something that could make a real difference for those who would come after her. And for the passenger, it was a challenge to confront his own role in the system and how he could use his newfound perspective to advocate for those who were often overlooked. In the end, neither of them could say they had won. But both had come to realize that true change wasn't about one person's victory. It was about recognizing the problems that existed, the struggles that people faced, and the responsibility they all shared in fixing them. The final message was clear: sometimes, it takes the unexpected, the painful, the chaotic moments to shake things up and make people see the world for what it really is. And as the flight attendant walked away from the turmoil, she knew one thing for sure: the journey was far from over. The road to change was long, but it was one she was now prepared to walk.